The real estate agent's card felt heavy in my trembling fingers as I stood outside Unit 47B of the Westside Storage Complex. 3 months had passed since David's funeral, and I still couldn't bring myself to open this door. The monthly rental fees were bleeding me dry, adding to the mountain of medical bills that had accumulated during his final weeks. Selling everything inside seemed like the practical choice, the responsible widow decision everyone expected me to make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had called Sandra Walsh, the agent who'd helped us buy our Victorian house on Maple Street 8 years ago. She specialized in estate sales and had a reputation for getting top dollar for everything from antique furniture to vintage cars. When I mentioned David's garage unit, her voice had perked up with interest. Industrial spaces in Cedar Mills were prime real estate. She explained, especially ones that had been maintained by meticulous owners like my late husband. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt as I fumbled with the key David had kept on a separate ring, away from our house keys. He'd always been particular about that garage, visiting it every Saturday morning without fail. When I'd asked to come along once, he'd smiled that patient smile of his, and said it was his space to think, to work on projects that bored me to tears. I'd never questioned it further. David Thompson was a software architect who needed solitude to create, and I respected that boundary. Now, standing here with Sandra's business card and a heart full of dread, I wondered why something as simple as cleaning out a storage unit felt like crossing into forbidden territory. The metal door was painted forest green, same as all the others in this row, but somehow it seemed different, heavier, more final. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Nicole Porter, my best friend since college, checking in as she had every day since the funeral. "How are you holding up today, Claire? Remember, you don't have to do everything at once." She'd offered to come with me, but this felt like something I needed to face alone. David's private space, his sanctuary away from our shared life. Opening it felt like reading someone's diary without permission. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. David had kept everything well maintained. Even this simple padlock showed no signs of rust or neglect. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs completely before a plunge into cold water, and turned the key. The lock clicked open, and I pulled up on the hand. The metal door rolled upward with a groan that seemed to echo across the entire complex. As the afternoon light spilled into the unit, I expected to see the usual contents of a man's workspace. Tool benches, maybe a project car, boxes of electronic components, the detritus of a technical mind at play. What I found instead made me take an involuntary step backward. The space was immaculate, organized with an almost military precision that I'd never seen from David at home. But it wasn't the cleanliness that shocked me. It was what the space contained. Against the far wall stood 3 tall filing cabinets, each one locked with heavy-duty padlock. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a single manila envelope with my name written in David's careful handwriting. Claire Thompson, it read, in the blue ink from the fountain pen I'd given him for our 5th wedding anniversary. But it was the walls that made my breath catch in my throat. Every available surface was covered with photographs, documents, and what looked like investigation material. Strings connected various photos and papers, creating a web of information that looked like something from a detective's office. And in the center of it all, a large photograph of a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful in that effortless way some people possess, with auburn hair and kind eyes. In the photo, she was laughing at something off camera, her face lit up with genuine joy. Below her picture, David had written a single word in his neat block letters, "Missing." I stepped into the garage slowly, as if sudden movements might cause the whole elaborate display to vanish like a mirage. The concrete floor was spotless, painted a clean gray that reflected the fluorescent lights David had installed overhead. This wasn't just a storage unit. This was an office, a command center, a place where my husband had been conducting some kind of investigation for God knows how long. My marriage to David Thompson had been the kind that people envied from the outside. We'd met at a technology conference in Portland 7 years ago, where he was presenting new software innovations, and I was covering the event for the local business journal. He'd approached me during the networking session, not with the awkward fumbling of most tech professionals, but with genuine curiosity about my work as a freelance writer. We'd talked for hours that night about everything except technology, discovering a shared love of hiking, old movies, and the kind of comfortable silence that comes with truly compatible people. Our courtship had been refreshingly straightforward. David was methodical in the way he approached everything, including romance. He'd call when he said he would, arrive precisely on time for dates, and never once played the exhausting games that had characterized my previous relationship. When he proposed a year later during a weekend trip to Crater Lake, it felt like the natural progression of something that had been inevitable from our first conversation. Marriage to David meant stability in ways I'd never experienced. He earned a substantial salary as a senior architect at Cascade Systems, enough that I could be selective about freelance assignments, and finally work on the novel I'd been talking about for years. He was methodical about finances, keeping detailed spreadsheets of our expenses and investments, planning for retirement, even though we were both in our 30s. Our Victorian house on Maple Street was his choice, a fixer-upper, that he'd restored room by room with the same patience he applied to debugging code. We'd settled into routines that felt comfortable rather than confining. Saturday mornings, David would disappear to his garage unit while I worked in the garden or caught up on reading. Sunday afternoons were for hiking the trails around Mount Hood or exploring the small towns scattered throughout the Willamette Valley. Evenings were spent cooking together, David handling the technical precision of baking while I managed the creative chaos of improvised dinner. We'd talked about children in the abstract way couples do before they're ready, agreeing that someday we'd like a family but never setting concrete timelines. David wanted to advance to a management position first, to ensure we'd have the financial security he deemed necessary for raising children properly. I wanted to finish my novel to establish myself as more than just a freelance journalist before taking on the full-time job of motherhood. There was always time, we told ourselves. David was only 41 when the chest pains started. The heart attack had come without warning on a Thursday morning in March. David had been getting ready for work, standing in our bathroom, adjusting his tie when he suddenly gripped the edge of the vanity and doubled over. I'd been in the kitchen packing his lunch when I heard the sound of him falling. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was unconscious. The doctor at Providence Portland Medical Center had used terms like massive cardiac event and extensive damage, but what it meant was simple. My husband was gone at 41, leaving behind a wife who suddenly didn't recognize her own life. The weeks following the funeral had passed in a blur of paperwork and condolences. David's life insurance provided financial security, but there were still decisions to be made about his belongings, his office equipment, the hundreds of small details that make up a shared life. His colleagues at Cascade Systems had been helpful but respectful of boundaries, boxing up his work materials and forwarding his final projects to other team members. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, had mentioned that David had been working on something personal in recent months, staying late at the office more frequently and seeming distracted during meetings. I'd attributed his distraction to work stress. David had been pushing for a promotion to lead architect, a position that would involve managing a team rather than just writing code. The transition from individual contributor to manager was weighing on him. I thought he'd always been more comfortable with computers than people, and the prospect of performance reviews and team meetings had been causing him anxiety. At least, that's what I'd told myself when I noticed him staying up later, checking his phone more frequently, taking calls in the garage or out on our back deck where I couldn't overhear. Now, standing in this pristine command center he'd created without my knowledge, I realized how much I'd been willing to overlook. The signs had been there, the separate key ring, the Saturday morning disappearances, the phone calls he'd take outside. I'd chalked it all up to work pressure, and his natural need for private space. David had always been an introvert who recharged alone, and I'd respected that aspect of his personality without question. But this wasn't introversion, this was something else entirely. I approached the desk cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The manila envelope with my name seemed to pulse with importance under the harsh fluorescent lights. Next to it sat a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews. A yellow sticky note attached to it read "Play first" in David's handwriting. My hand trembled as I picked up the recorder and found the play button. David's voice filled the space, clear and familiar, making my knees weak with the sudden rush of grief and confusion. "Claire, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and you've found my workspace. I know this must be confusing and probably frightening. I want you to know that everything I've done here, every hour I've spent away from you, has been to protect you. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid you'd think I was crazy, afraid you'd leave, afraid of what it would mean for us." He paused and I could hear him take a shaky breath before continuing. "The woman in the photograph is named Isabella Martinez. She disappeared 3 years ago from her apartment in Bend, Oregon. The police investigation lasted 6 months before they declared it a cold case. No evidence of foul play, they said, no signs of struggle. Isabella simply vanished one Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind her job, her car, her entire life. But she didn't disappear voluntarily, Claire. She was taken, and I know who took her." The recorder continued playing, but I had to sit down in David's desk chair to process what I was hearing. My husband, the methodical software architect who planned our grocery shopping a week in advance, had been conducting a private investigation into a missing person case, a case that apparently the police had given up on. I met Isabella's sister, Lucia, about 18 months ago at a technology conference in Bend. She was working for a local startup, and we got to talking during a break between sessions. When she found out I lived in Millbrook, she asked if I'd ever heard about Isabella's case. The media coverage had been minimal, she said, because Isabella didn't fit the profile that generates public interest. She was 34, lived alone, had a history of depression. The kind of person whose disappearance gets written off as a voluntary departure from a difficult life. David's voice grew stronger, more determined. But Lucia showed me Isabella's apartment complex, her workplace, the coffee shop where she'd eaten breakfast the morning she disappeared. She showed me the security footage from nearby businesses, the inconsistencies in the police report, the evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed. "Claire, there was a man following Isabella in the weeks before she disappeared. The same man appeared in the background of multiple security videos, always at a distance, always careful to avoid being clearly photographed. The police said it was coincidental. Lucia knew it wasn't." I found myself leaning forward, caught up in David's narrative despite my shock. This was a side of my husband I'd never seen, passionate and driven by something beyond the logical problem-solving that characterized his professional work. I started helping Lucia in my spare time, using my skills to enhance security footage, to trace digital footprints, to analyze patterns in ways the understaffed Bend Police Department couldn't or wouldn't do. What we found led us to a man named Vincent Cross, a contractor who'd been working on renovations in Isabella's apartment complex. The month before she disappeared, Cross had a history of harassment, complaints from female clients, complaints that had been settled quietly out of court. He also had connections to 2 other missing women cases in Oregon and Northern California. The recording paused again, and when David's voice returned, it carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Claire, we found evidence linking Vincent Cross to Isabella's disappearance. Digital evidence, financial records, testimony from witnesses the police never interviewed. But when Lucia tried to present this information to the authorities, she was told that the case was closed and that her private investigation was interfering with official police work. That's when things became dangerous." My hands were shaking now, gripping the edge of the desk as David's story continued. 2 weeks after Lucia's meeting with the police, her apartment was broken in. Nothing was stolen, but her computer files were deleted, and her research materials were destroyed. Then she started receiving phone calls, anonymous voices telling her to stop looking for her sister. The message was clear: back off or face consequence. That's when I made the decision to take over the investigation completely, to keep Lucia safe by removing her from the equation. The recording clicked off, leaving me sitting in stunned silence in my dead husband's secret office. The afternoon light streaming through the small window had shifted, casting new shadows across the wall of photographs and documents. I could see now that the strings connecting various pieces of evidence formed a timeline, starting with Isabella's disappearance 3 years ago, and continuing right up until recent months. I stood up on unsteady legs and walked to the wall display, following the thread of David's investigation. There were photographs of Vincent Cross, surveillance images that showed him near Isabella's apartment building, financial records that tracked his movements in the weeks surrounding her disappearance, but there were also newer photographs, images that made my blood run cold. Vincent Cross hadn't stopped with Isabella Martinez. David had documented evidence connecting him to 3 other missing women across the Pacific Northwest. Each case followed a similar pattern: a single woman living alone, a contractor or service worker who'd had access to their homes, a disappearance that police attributed to voluntary departure rather than foul play. And in the corner of the display, marked with red string and highlighted with yellow markers, were recent photographs of Cross in Millbrook, outside the grocery store where I shopped, at the coffee shop where I met clients, in the parking lot of the gym where I took yoga classes. Vincent Cross had been watching me. The manila envelope on the desk suddenly felt urgent in a way that made my hands shake as I opened it. Inside were copies of David's research, organized with the methodical precision I'd come to expect from him. But there was also a letter, written in his careful handwriting on our personal stationery. "My dearest Claire," it began, "if you're reading this letter, it means that Vincent Cross has succeeded in stopping my investigation. I've taken precautions to ensure your safety, but you need to understand the danger you're in. Cross knows that I've been investigating him. He knows about the evidence I've gathered, and he knows about you." The letter continued with detailed instructions for contacting the FBI, for accessing additional evidence David had stored in multiple locations, for protecting myself until Cross could be apprehended. But it was the final paragraph that broke my heart completely. "I'm sorry for keeping this from you, Claire. I'm sorry for the secrets, for the lies by omission, for choosing to protect you by shutting you out. You deserved to know the truth from the beginning. You deserved to be part of this decision. But I was so afraid of losing you, that I risked losing myself instead. If something happens to me, please know that every moment of our marriage was real. Every quiet evening, every shared laugh, every plan we made for the future, that was all true, even if this investigation was the shadow hanging over it." I sank back into the chair, David's letter clutched in my trembling hands, and finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for David's death, but for the marriage I thought I'd known, for the safety I'd believed we shared, for the future we'd planned together that had been built on foundations I'd never even seen. The sun was setting outside the small window, casting the garage in deeper shadows. I needed to call Nicole, needed to call the FBI number David had provided, needed to lock this place up and go home to figure out what came next. But first, I sat in the gathering darkness of my husband's secret world and mourned for the man I'd loved, and the woman I'd been before walking through that metal door. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, I was still just Claire Thompson, widow, trying to understand how the man who'd brought me coffee every morning had been living a completely different life every Saturday for the past 18 months, how he'd been protecting me from a danger I'd never known existed, how he'd died, still keeping me safe from a truth that was now mine to carry alone. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every shadow outside my bedroom window looked like Vincent Cross. Every creak of our old Victorian house sounded like footsteps on the front porch. David's letter lay on my nightstand next to the digital recorder, both serving as proof that my entire understanding of our life together had been a carefully constructed illusion. At 5 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee with shaking hands. The kitchen that had once felt like the heart of our home now seemed exposed, vulnerable. The large windows that David and I had loved for their view of the garden now felt like security risks. I found myself standing to the side when I opened the curtains, paranoid about being visible from the street. Nicole arrived at 7, letting herself in through the back door as she had countless times before. She took one look at my face and immediately went to make fresh coffee, stronger than my trembling attempts. Nicole Porter had been my anchor through David's death, the friend who'd shown up without being asked,
and stayed without being invited. A trauma nurse at Providence, Portland, she had an uncanny ability to remain calm in crisis situations that would send most people into panic. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks," she said, settling into the breakfast nook across from me. "What happened yesterday? Did the storage unit not go well?" I handed her David's letter without explanation. Nicole read in silence, her professional composure slipping as she reached the sections about Vincent Cross. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully and looked at me with the kind of intensity I'd seen her use with critical patients. "Claire, we need to call the police right now, today, this minute." "I already called the FBI number David provided," I said, my voice hoarse from exhaustion.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Special Agent Helena Marsh is driving down from Portland this morning. She'll be here at 10. Nicole nodded approvingly. Good. What else can I do? Do you want to stay at my place until this is resolved? The offer was tempting, but something in David's letter had made it clear that running wouldn't solve anything. Vincent Cross had been watching me for months, learning my routines, my patterns. Hiding would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "I need to understand what David discovered," I said. "There's more in that garage, Nicole. Filing cabinets full of evidence. Research that goes back years. If I'm going to face this, I need to know everything." Nicole studied my face with the same careful attention she gave her patients. "Then we'll face it together. But not alone, and not without the FBI knowing exactly where we are." Agent Helena Marsh arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving an unremarkable sedan that could have belonged to any suburban parent. She was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with short brown hair and the kind of steady presence that immediately made me feel safer. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in a small leather journal, while I played David's recording and showed her copies of his research. "Your husband was thorough," she said when I finished. "Some of this information aligns with cases we've been tracking. Vincent Cross has been on our radar for the past year, but we haven't had enough evidence to make arrests. David's investigation fills in several gaps." "So, you believe David was right, that Cross is responsible for these disappearances?" Agent Marsh nodded grimly. "We believe Cross is part of a larger network trafficking women throughout the Pacific Northwest. The women he targets are carefully chosen. Single, isolated, with limited family connections, who might pursue investigations when they disappear. Isabella Martinez fit that profile perfectly, but she had a sister," I protested. "Lucia was the one who got David involved in the first place. Lucia Martinez was killed in a car accident 6 weeks ago," Agent Marsh said, quietly. "Single vehicle collision on a mountain road outside Bend. Brake failure, according to the investigating officers." The coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. Nicole immediately went for paper towels while I sat frozen, processing this new information. Lucia was dead. The woman who'd started David on this investigation, who'd trusted him to continue searching for her sister, was gone. "That's why Cross has turned his attention to you," Agent Marsh continued. "With Lucia dead, and your husband's investigation ended, you're the last person who might have access to the evidence they've gathered. He needs to know what you know, but I didn't know anything," I said desperately. "Until yesterday, I had no idea David was involved in any of this. Cross doesn't know that. From his perspective, you're the wife of the man who'd been building a case against him. You're a threat that needs to be eliminated." Nicole finished cleaning up the broken coffee cup and sat back down beside me, her hand finding mine across the table. "What happens now? How do we keep Claire safe?" Agent Marsh consulted her notes. "First, we need to secure all of David's research. You said there are filing cabinets in the storage unit that you haven't opened yet." I nodded. 3 large cabinets, all locked. David left keys, but I was too overwhelmed yesterday to look through everything. "We'll do that today, with full FBI support. I've got a team coming down from Portland to process the scene and catalog everything David collected. Second, we're going to set up surveillance on your house and establish protocols for your daily activities." "Surveillance?" The word made my stomach clench. "You mean Someone will be watching my house, both watching and protecting. Cross has been escalating his behavior since David's death. We've documented him driving past your house multiple times, following you to the grocery store, even sitting in the parking lot outside your yoga studio. He's building up to something, and we need to be ready. Nicole squeezed my hand. I'm staying here until this is over. I can work from home, and Claire shouldn't be alone. Agent Marsh nodded approvingly. That's good. The more disruption we can create in Cross's surveillance patterns, the better. He's been studying Claire's routines for months. Changing those routines makes it harder for him to predict her movements. We drove to the storage facility in a small convoy. Agent Marsh in her sedan, Nicole and me in her Honda, and a plain white van that held 2 FBI technicians and their equipment. The afternoon was overcast, typical Oregon weather that cast everything in muted grays, and made the industrial complex look even more desolate than it had the day before. The garage unit felt different with other people inside. Agent Marsh and her technicians moved through David's displays with professional efficiency, photographing everything before touching it. They treated his investigation like a crime scene, which I supposed it was. My husband had been murdered by a heart attack at 41, but Vincent Cross had killed him just as surely as if he'd used a weapon. Mrs. Thompson, could you unlock these filing cabinets? Agent Marsh asked. I'd like you to be present when we open them, in case there are materials that require context only you can provide. The keys David had left were clearly labeled Cabinet A, Cabinet B, Cabinets, each one open to reveal meticulously organized files that demonstrated the scope of David's investigation. Cabinet A contained everything related to Isabella Martinez. Police reports, witness statements, David had conducted independently, financial records and photographs of her apartment complex and workplace. But there were also personal items, copies of Isabella's journal entries that Lucia had provided, photographs from her childhood, letters she'd written to friends that painted a picture of a woman trying to rebuild her life after a difficult divorce. Cabinet B held information about the other missing women. David had connected to Vincent Cross, Maria Santos, from Eugene, disappeared 14 months ago, Jennifer Walsh, from Corvallis, missing for 8 months, Ashley Chen, from Salem, vanished just 3 months ago. Each file was as thorough as Isabella's, documenting the pattern of a predator who carefully selected his victims and executed his crimes with methodical precision. But it was Cabinet C that made Agent Marsh's expression grow truly grim. This cabinet contained David's surveillance of Vincent Cross himself, hundreds of photographs documenting Cross's movements, his vehicle, his associates, and his method. David had somehow managed to track Cross to a remote property in the Cascade Mountains, an isolated compound that appeared to be serving as some kind of detention facility. Jesus Christ, Agent Marsh muttered, holding up a series of photographs that showed the mountain compound from multiple angles. David got closer to this operation than we ever have. These images are going to be crucial evidence. One of the FBI technicians called Agent Marsh over to the computer setup David had established in the corner of the garage. He'd connected multiple monitors to a central processing unit that looked far more sophisticated than anything a typical software architect would need for personal projects. Agent Marsh, you need to see this, the technician said. Thompson wasn't just investigating Cross, he was actively monitoring him. This system has been recording Cross's digital communications for the past 6 months. Nicole and I exchanged glances. Digital surveillance was several steps beyond the investigation I'd imagined David conducting. This was the kind of work that required serious technical expertise and probably violated numerous federal laws. How did he gain access to Cross's communications? Agent Marsh asked. The technician scrolled through screens of data that meant nothing to me but clearly impressed the FBI agents. It looks like Thompson identified vulnerabilities in Cross's security systems and exploited them. This is sophisticated work, possibly illegal, but incredibly valuable intelligence. Agent Marsh turned to me. Did your husband ever mention having contacts in law enforcement or federal agencies? This level of technical capability suggests he might have been working with someone who had official resources. I shook my head. David never mentioned anything like that. But I paused, remembering something that had seemed insignificant at the time. About 6 months ago, he started receiving phone calls from someone named Frank. David would always take those calls in private, and afterward he'd seem energized, like he'd received good news or helpful information. Frank, what? Did he ever mention a last name? I don't think so, but David would write notes after those calls, usually just names or dates, scribbled on whatever paper was handy. I found them annoying because he'd leave them scattered around the house, but I never paid attention to what they said. Agent Marsh made a note. We'll need to search your house for any of those notes David might have left behind. If Frank was providing David with information or technical support, we need to identify him. The technician who'd been examining David's computer system called out again. Agent Marsh, I found something else. Thompson's files include detailed floor plans of the mountain compound, guard schedules, and what appears to be a planned rescue operation. The garage fell silent except for the humming of David's computer equipment. Agent Marsh walked over to examine the screen, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read through David's files. Mrs. Thompson, your husband wasn't just investigating Vincent Cross, he was planning to raid that compound himself. These files show he'd identified where the missing women are being held, and he was developing a plan to get them out. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet again. The David I'd married was cautious, methodical, someone who researched restaurants for weeks before making dinner reservations. The idea that he'd been planning some kind of vigilante rescue mission seemed impossible. But that's insane, I said. David wasn't trained for that kind of operation. He was a software architect, not some kind of action hero. Agent Marsh looked up from the computer screen. According to these files, he wasn't planning to go alone. He'd been coordinating with someone code-named Ranger, who apparently has military or law enforcement experience. And based on the timeline in these documents, the rescue operation was scheduled for next week. Nicole moved closer to me, her presence grounding me as this new reality continued to unfold. Claire, when exactly did David have his heart attack? What day? Thursday, March 15th. I said. Why? Agent Marsh consulted David's files on the computer. According to this timeline, David was supposed to meet with Ranger on Friday, March 16th, to finalize their rescue plan. The operation was scheduled for the following weekend. The implications hit me like a physical blow. David's heart attack hadn't been a random medical event. The stress of planning a dangerous rescue mission, the pressure of months of investigation, the knowledge that time was running out for the women being held at that compound, it had literally killed him. Agent Marsh, I said, my voice barely steady, if David was right about where those women are being held, and if his rescue plan was viable, what happens now? Do those women just stay imprisoned because my husband died before he could save them? Agent Marsh closed David's files and turned to face me directly. Mrs. Thompson, what happens now depends partly on what else we find in your husband's research and partly on whether we can identify this Ranger contact. But I can tell you this. The FBI has been trying to locate these missing women for over a year. If David's intelligence is accurate, it could break open a trafficking ring that extends far beyond Oregon. One of the technicians had been quietly photographing the wall displays while we talked. Now he approached Agent Marsh with a digital camera, scrolling through images he'd captured. Agent Marsh, you should look at this. Thompson had a section of his display labeled Future Targets. There are photographs of women Cross has been surveilling, including Miss Thompson, but there are others too. The camera screen showed a section of David's wall that I hadn't noticed the day before, probably because it had been hidden behind one of the open filing cabinets. Photographs of at least 6 different women, all taken without their knowledge in public places around Millbrook and Portland. Under each photograph, David had written notes about their daily routines, their living situations, their apparent vulnerability to Cross's method. I recognized 2 of the women immediately. One was my yoga instructor, Sarah, a divorced mother of 2 who lived alone after her ex-husband moved to California. The other was the young barista at Blue Moon Cafe, a college student named Lily who walked to work alone every morning at 5:30. He's not just after me, I whispered. Cross is planning to take more women. David knew that, and he was trying to stop it.
Agent Marsh studied the photographs with growing urgency. Mrs. Thompson, we need to expedite this investigation. If Cross is preparing to escalate his operation, we might have days rather than weeks to prevent more disappearances. She turned to address her team. I want this entire garage processed and photographed within the next 2 hours. Everything gets copied and cataloged. We'll set up a command center at the Portland field office tonight and brief the task force first thing tomorrow morning. As the FBI technicians worked around us, Nicole and I sat in David's desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd discovered. My husband hadn't just been investigating a cold case in his spare time. He'd uncovered an active trafficking operation and died trying to stop it. Now it was up to the FBI to finish what he'd started, and somehow I'd become a central figure in their investigation. Claire, Nicole said quietly, I know this is all overwhelming, but I want you to think about something. David spent months investigating this case, months planning a rescue operation, and he never told you any of it. Why do you think he kept you in the dark? It was a question I'd been avoiding since finding the garage, but Nicole was right to ask it. David's secrecy hadn't just been about protecting me from danger, it had been about protecting me from a version of himself that I'd never known existed. I think he was afraid I'd try to stop him, I said finally. If I'd known he was planning something this dangerous, I would have demanded he turn everything over to the authorities and walk away. David knew I'd prioritize our safety over those missing women. Would you have? Nicole asked. I thought about Isabella Martinez, about the other women whose photographs covered David's walls, about the future victims Cross was already targeting. I thought about the compound in the mountains where David believed these women were being held, and about the rescue operation he'd died before completing.
No, I said. I wouldn't have stopped him. I would have demanded to help. Agent Marsh had been listening to our conversation while reviewing David's files. Now she looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miss Johnson, based on what we've found here today, we're going to need your continued cooperation in this investigation. David's research is incredibly valuable, but there are gaps that only someone who knew him personally might be able to fill. Would you be willing to work with our task force as a consultant? The request should have terrified me. Just 2 days ago, my biggest concern had been whether to sell David's storage unit or keep paying the monthly rental fee. Now I was being asked to help the FBI investigate a trafficking ring that had already killed my husband and threatened my life. But sitting in David's secret office, surrounded by evidence of his months-long fight for justice, I realized there was only one answer I could give. Agent Marsh, if working with you helps save those women and stops Vincent Cross, then yes, I'll do whatever you need me to do. Outside the storage unit, the Oregon afternoon was fading into evening. Soon I'd go home to my empty Victorian house, try to sleep in the bed I'd shared with a man I'd apparently never really known, and wake up tomorrow to begin a new life as an FBI consultant hunting the predator who'd been stalking me for months. David had died, trying to finish this fight. I was going to make sure he hadn't died in vain. The FBI field office in Portland hummed with an energy I'd never experienced before. Agents moved between workstations with purposeful urgency, their conversations a mixture of technical jargon and criminal terminology that made my head spin. Agent Marsh had set up a conference room for our task force, with David's wall displays recreated on whiteboards and his digital files projected onto multiple screens around the room. I sat at a long table with my laptop transcribing notes from David's handwritten journals while Agent Marsh coordinated with teams across 3 states. The scope of Vincent Cross's operation was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence we analyzed. This wasn't just about missing women from Oregon. Cross was part of a network that moved victims from Seattle to Sacramento, using isolated properties throughout the Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges as temporary holding facilities. We'd been trying to identify the contact your husband referred to as Ranger, Agent Marsh said, settling into the chair across from me. Did David ever mention military friends or colleagues with law enforcement backgrounds? I shook my head. David wasn't really the type to maintain friendships from before we met. He was focused on work and our life together. The only people I knew him to spend time with were colleagues from Cascade Systems and neighbors. Agent Marsh consulted her notes. What about Frank Donovan? We found several references to that name in David's files, and it seems to correlate with the timeline of his investigation. The name sparked a memory I'd forgotten until now. Frank Donovan was our neighbor when we first moved to Maple Street. He lived in the blue house 2 doors down, but he moved away about 2 years ago. David mentioned running into him occasionally at the hardware store or the coffee shop, but I didn't think they were particularly close. What did you know about Donovan's background? He was retired military, I think, Army or Marines, something that involved overseas deployment. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years before we moved in, and some of the other neighbors mentioned he'd done security consulting work after he left the service. Agent Marsh made a note and signaled to one of her team members, "Let's run a full background check on Frank Donovan, especially military service records and any private security work he might have done in Oregon." While the FBI team worked on identifying Ranger, I continued reviewing David's personal notes, trying to piece together the timeline of his investigation. The journals revealed a progression that started with simple curiosity about Isabella Martinez's case, and evolved into an obsession that consumed his free time and mental energy. David's entries from 18 months ago were clinical, focused on data analysis and pattern recognition. He'd approached Isabella's disappearance like a coding problem, breaking it down into logical components that could be systematically analyzed. But as the months progressed, his writing became more personal, more emotionally invested in the outcome. March 3rd, I read aloud from one of his journals. "Spoke with Isabella's former coworker today. She confirmed that Isabella had been receiving unwanted attention from a contractor working on the apartment complex. The man matched Cross's description and timeline. Isabella told her friend she was considering moving to a different apartment because the contractor made her uncomfortable. She never got the chance." Agent Marsh looked up from her laptop. "That's new information. Our original case files didn't include interviews with Isabella's coworker." "David was thorough," I said, continuing to read through his notes. "He interviewed people the police never talked to, asked questions that weren't part of the official investigation. Listen to this entry from April. Cross's pattern is sophisticated. He targets women during vulnerable life transitions, recent divorces, job changes, family deaths. He uses his contractor credentials to gain access to their homes, studies their routines, identifies their support network. Then he waits for the perfect opportunity when they're isolated and unlikely to be missed immediately." The clinical description of Cross's methods made my skin crawl. David had understood exactly how predators like Cross operated, which meant he'd also understood how vulnerable I'd become after his death. A widow with no children, few close friends, and a routine that Cross had been studying for months. Agent Marsh's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly, her expression growing serious. "Mrs. Thompson, we've got a problem. Our surveillance team reports that Cross drove past your house 3 times this morning. He's escalating his reconnaissance." My hands trembled as I closed David's journal. "What does that mean? Is he getting ready to—" "We don't know yet, but we're not taking any chances. I'm assigning a protective detail to stay with you around the clock. Agent Martinez will be your primary contact." She gestured to a younger woman who'd been working quietly at a computer station. "Sarah Martinez is a specialist in trafficking cases, and she's also Lucia Martinez's cousin." Agent Sarah Martinez approached our table with a combination of professional composure and personal grief that I recognized immediately. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair, and the same intelligent eyes I'd seen in photographs of Isabella and Lucia. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that this case is personal for me," she said, sitting down beside me. "Lucia was more than my cousin. She was my best friend. When she started investigating Isabella's disappearance, I tried to convince her to let law enforcement handle it. I thought she was putting herself in danger by conducting her own investigation." "You were right," I said quietly. Agent Martinez nodded grimly. "I was right about the danger, but I was wrong about law enforcement being able to handle it. The local police in Bend didn't have the resources or expertise to investigate a trafficking operation. Lucia's independent investigation provided crucial evidence that the official case had missed. Your husband continued that work after Lucia was killed. Do you think Cross was responsible for Lucia's car accident?" "I'm certain of it. The brake failure that caused her accident required mechanical expertise and access to her vehicle. Cross had both." He'd been watching Lucia the same way he's been watching you. Agent Marsh rejoined our conversation after finishing a phone call. We've got an update on Frank Donovan. Military records confirm he served 3 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger with specialized training in reconnaissance and hostage recovery. After leaving the service, he worked for private security companies in the Pacific Northwest. His current address is listed as a rural property outside Estacada, about 40 minutes from here. That fits the timeline, I said. David mentioned seeing Frank occasionally after he moved away from our neighborhood. If Frank was living in Estacada, that would put him close to the mountain areas where Cross has been operating. Agent Martinez pulled up a map on her tablet. Estacada is also near the compound location your husband identified in his surveillance photograph. If Donovan was helping David plan a rescue operation, his property would be an ideal staging area. Are we going to contact him? I asked. Agent Marsh hesitated. We need to be careful. If Donovan was working with David outside official channels, he might not trust federal agents. But we also can't afford to waste time if he has information that could help us locate the missing women. While the agents debated their approach to Frank Donovan, I continued reading through David's journal. The entries from his final weeks painted a picture of a man under enormous stress, torn between his desire to save the missing women and his fear of the consequences for our marriage. February 20th, read one entry. Cross knows about my investigation. Found evidence that my computer has been hacked. Emails monitored. Need to assume all digital communications are compromised. Meeting with Ranger tomorrow to discuss acceleration of timeline. February 28th. Told Claire I had to work late again. The lies are eating me alive, but I can't risk her safety by involving her. Cross has started driving past our house. He's sending a message. March 10th. Chest pains again today. Stress is taking its toll, but we're so close to having everything we need for the rescue operation. Ranger confirms compound location and guard schedules. Just need 5 more days to finalize extraction routes. March 10th was 5 days before David's heart attack. He'd been literally counting down to the rescue operation when the stress killed him. Agent Martinez had been reading over my shoulder. Your husband knew he was running out of time, didn't he? The medical stress, the psychological pressure of keeping secrets from you, the knowledge that Cross was escalating his surveillance. David always pushed himself too hard, I said. When he committed to something, he'd work 18-hour days until it was finished. I used to worry about his stress levels even before I knew about any of this. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed our home number, which was impossible since Nicole and I were both at the FBI field office. Agent Marsh immediately signaled for the call to be traced while I answered on speaker. Hello? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire Thompson. The voice was male, calm, with no accent I could identify. My name is Vincent Cross. The conference room went silent except for the sound of agents frantically typing on their keyboards. Agent Marsh had her hand on a second phone, presumably coordinating the trade. I don't know who you are, I said, following Agent Marsh's whispered instructions. Cross chuckled. Of course you do, Claire. Your husband spent months investigating me. I'm sure you've found his research by now. I don't know what you're talking about. Claire, let's not waste time with denials. I'm calling because I have a proposal for you. Your husband had something that belongs to me, evidence that he stole through illegal surveillance. I want it back. Agent Marsh was writing notes on a piece of paper, showing me how to respond. What evidence? I read from her note. Digital files, photographs, communications records. Your husband was very thorough in documenting my business activities. Those files need to be returned to prevent any misunderstandings. And if I don't have what you're looking for. The line was quiet for several seconds. When Cross spoke again, his tone had shifted from conversational to threatening. Claire, I've been watching you for months. I know your routines, your friends, your vulnerability. I know about the yoga studio, the coffee shop, the grocery store where you shop every Tuesday afternoon. I know about Nicole Porter, your friend who's been staying with you since your husband died. My blood went cold. Cross had been watching me closely enough to know about Nicole's presence in my house. What I also know, Cross continued, is that you're not nearly as isolated as the other women I've worked with. You have friends, family,
People who would notice if you disappear. That makes you a more complicated target, but not an impossible one. Agent Marsh was writing furiously, showing me a note that read, "Keep him talking, almost have the trace." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want David's files, all of them. Digital copies, physical documents, whatever evidence he collected during his investigation. In exchange, I'll disappear and you'll never hear from me again." "How do I know you'll keep your word?" Cross laughed again. "Claire, you don't have a choice but to trust me. The alternative is that I continue my work in this area, which means you and your friends remain in danger indefinitely." Agent Marsh held up a note. "Ask about the women." "What about the women you've taken?" I asked. "Isabella Martinez and the other." "That's not part of our negotiation, Claire. My only offer is for your safety and the safety of people close to you. What happened to those other women is unfortunate, but it's not reversible." The callousness in his voice made me angry enough to forget Agent Marsh's coaching. "You're talking about human beings, not business transactions." "I'm talking about reality," Cross said. "Your husband tried to be a hero and it killed him. Don't make the same mistake." Agent Marsh was signaling frantically, but before I could respond, Cross continued. "You have 24 hours to gather David's files. Tomorrow night at 11, drive to the Cascade Locks, overlook on the Columbia River. Come alone, bring everything, and this ends peacefully. And if I don't,
Then I start working through your social circle systematically. Nicole Porter lives alone in that converted warehouse downtown. Sarah Fleming from your yoga studio walks to her car alone every evening after class. Lily Chen opens the coffee shop by herself every morning at 5:30. He'd named 3 women I cared about, proving he'd been watching me closely enough to identify my friends and their vulnerabilities. Cross wasn't just threatening me, he was threatening everyone in my life. 24 hours, Claire. Don't disappoint me." The line went dead. Agent Marsh immediately started coordinating with her team, issuing orders for protective details on Nicole, Sarah, and Lily. The trace had been partially successful. Cross had called from somewhere in the Portland metropolitan area, but the exact location was still being determined. "Miss Thompson, we're going to use this meeting to our advantage," Agent Marsh said. "Cross wants David's files, which means he's afraid of what they contain. We're going to give him what he wants, but with modifications that will help us track him." Agent Martinez looked up from her laptop. "What about the rescue operation David was planning? If Cross is focused on getting the evidence back, this might be our chance to locate the compound and extract the missing women." "That's exactly what we're thinking," Agent Marsh said. "But first, we need to contact Frank Donovan and find out what David's original plan involved." She turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this is overwhelming, but we need you to make contact with Donovan. He's more likely to trust David's widow than federal agents he's never met. What if he doesn't want to get involved? What if he thinks it's too dangerous without David?" Agent Marsh studied the map of Cross's suspected compound. "Then we'll have to try a federal raid without inside intelligence. But I'd rather have Donovan's expertise and local knowledge than go in blind." I thought about David's final journal entries, about his determination to save the missing women, even though he knew the stress was killing him. He died believing that Frank Donovan would help complete the rescue operation. "I'll call him," I said, "but I want to be part of whatever plan you develop." David didn't spend months on this investigation just to hand it over to federal agents who might approach it like a typical law enforcement operation. Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. "Your husband's research was more comprehensive than anything we've been able to develop through official channels. You understand this case better than anyone except possibly Donovan." Agent Marsh looked uncertain. "Mrs. Thompson, involving civilians in active operations goes against protocol. We can't guarantee your safety if things go wrong." "You can't guarantee my safety anyway," I pointed out. "Cross has made it clear that he'll keep targeting me and my friends until this is resolved. The only way to end this is to stop him permanently." Outside the conference room windows, Portland was settling into evening. Somewhere in the mountains east of the city, Isabella Martinez and other women were being held prisoner by Vincent Cross's trafficking network. David had died trying to save them, and now it was up to us to finish what he'd started. But first, We had to survive the next 24 hours, and somehow turn Cross's demand for David's files into an opportunity to destroy his entire operation. The plan we developed would either save the missing women, or get us all killed. I pulled out my phone to call Frank Donovan, hoping that David's former neighbor was as committed to justice as my husband had been. Frank Donovan answered his phone on the third ring, his voice carrying the measured caution of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected calls. When I identified myself as David Thompson's widow, the line went silent for nearly 30 seconds. "Claire," he said finally, "I was wondering if you'd reach out. I'm sorry for your loss. David was a good man who died trying to do the right thing. Mr. Donovan, I need to ask you about the work you were doing with my husband. The FBI is involved now, and we have less than 24 hours before Vincent Cross expects me to turn over all of David's research." Another pause. "Are you calling from a secure line?" I looked at Agent Marsh, who nodded and activated a scrambling device attached to the conference room phone system. "Yes, we're at the FBI field office in Portland. Agent Helena Marsh is coordinating the task force." "Put me on speaker," Donovan said. "Agent Marsh, I assume you've reviewed David's surveillance files and understand the scope of Cross's operation." Agent Marsh leaned toward the phone. "Mr. Donovan, we've seen your husband's intelligence gathering, but we need to understand the rescue operation you two were planning. According to David's timeline, you were supposed to execute something this weekend." "That's correct." David had identified the exact location where the women are being held, mapped the compound's security systems, and documented guard rotation. We had a 48-hour window when Cross would be traveling to Seattle for what David's digital surveillance indicated was a meeting with his trafficking contacts. Agent Martinez pulled up the mountain compound photographs on her laptop. "Mr. Donovan, how confident were you that David's intelligence was accurate? Federal raids require certainty about target locations and civilian safety." Donovan's voice carried absolute conviction. "Agent Martinez, I've planned and executed rescue operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia. David's intelligence was more comprehensive than anything I worked with in the military. He'd identified not just the compound location, but the internal layout, communication systems, and personnel schedules." "What was your role supposed to be?" Agent Marsh asked. "Tactical planning and execution." David had the intelligence capabilities, but he wasn't trained for hostile extraction. My job was to get those women out alive while David provided technical support and coordination. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into the operational details despite my fear. "Mr. Donovan, David never told me about any military training. How did you know he could handle the technical aspects of a rescue operation?" "Claire, your husband was one of the most disciplined people I've ever worked with. Once he committed to saving those women, he approached it like a military campaign. He spent months learning tactical communication, studying extraction procedures, even training physically to handle the demands of the operation." The revelation that David had been secretly preparing for combat operations made my heart ache with a mixture of pride and grief. He'd transformed himself from a software architect into someone capable of conducting military-style rescues, all while maintaining the facade of our normal married life. Agent Marsh consulted her notes. "Miss Donovan, we have a tactical team ready to move, but we need your local knowledge and David's intelligence to plan the operation. Are you willing to work with federal agents?" Agent Marsh, "I've been waiting 3 days for this call. David died believing we were going to save those women this weekend. I'm not going to let bureaucratic procedures prevent us from finishing what he started." Relief flooded through me. Frank Donovan was committed to completing David's mission, which meant the women Cross had taken might actually have a chance at rescue. "There's another complication," I said. "Cross has demanded that I meet him tomorrow night at Cascade Locks to turn over David's file. The FBI wants to use that meeting to capture Cross, but I'm worried it might compromise the rescue operation." Donovan was quiet for a moment, presumably considering the tactical implications. "Actually, that could work in our favor. If Cross is focused on retrieving David's evidence, he'll be away from the compound during our extraction window, but we need to coordinate both operations simultaneously." Agent Martinez looked up from her laptop. "Mr. Donovan, how many women are we talking about?" David's files reference Isabella Martinez and 3 others, but Cross's operation might be larger than we initially understood. Based on David's surveillance, there are currently 6 women being held at the mountain compound: Isabella Martinez, Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, Ashley Chen, and 2 others David identified from recent missing person reports. One of them is only 19 years old. The number hit me like a physical blow. 6 women, including a teenager, being held prisoner while Cross had been stalking me and threatening my friends. David had known about all of them, had been carrying the weight of their captivity while pretending everything was normal in our marriage. Agent Marsh was already coordinating with her team, issuing orders for additional tactical support and medical personnel. Mr. Donovan, can you be in Portland tonight? We need to finalize operational plans and coordinate our timeline with the Cross meeting. I'll be there in 2 hours. Agent Marsh, I'm bringing David's backup files and the tactical equipment we'd prepared for the operation. Everything David and I planned is still viable, but we need to execute it perfectly. After ending the call with Donovan, Agent Marsh turned to address the full task force. People, we've got 18 hours to coordinate 2 simultaneous operations. Team Alpha will handle the Claire Thompson meeting with Cross at Cascade Locks. Team Beta will execute the compound rescue with Donovan's assistance. Both operations are high risk, but they're also our best chance to end Cross's trafficking network permanently. Agent Martinez approached me while the tactical teams began their planning. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand what you're agreeing to. The meeting with Cross tomorrow night will be extremely dangerous, even with FBI protection. Cross is desperate, which makes him unpredictable. Agent Martinez, Cross has already threatened to kill my friends if I don't cooperate. The meeting is happening whether I want it or not. At least this way, we can use it to help save those women. She nodded approvingly. Your husband would be proud of your courage, but Claire, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Cross might not honor his agreement. Men like him don't walk away from trafficking operations because they've been exposed. What are you saying? I'm saying that Cross's real plan might be to eliminate you and anyone else who knows about his operation. The meeting at Cascade Locks could be an ambush, not a negotiation. The possibility that Cross intended to kill me regardless of whether I brought David's files was terrifying but not surprising. David's research had documented Cross as a methodical predator who eliminated threats to his operation with the same clinical precision he used to select victims. Agent Marsh rejoined our conversation after coordinating with the tactical teams. Mrs. Thompson, we've modified David's files to include tracking software that will help us monitor Cross's digital communications if he attempts to access them. We're also preparing decoy files that will appear comprehensive but won't actually compromise ongoing investigations. Will Cross be able to tell their decoys? Not immediately. We've included enough genuine intelligence to make them appear authentic, but the most sensitive information has been altered or removed. If Cross discovers the deception, it will be after we've already executed the rescue operation. Nicole arrived at the FBI field office as evening settled over Portland, bringing dinner and a change of clothes from my house. She'd been under protective surveillance since Cross's phone call, with agents monitoring her downtown warehouse apartment and escorting her to work at the hospital. Claire, this is insane, she said, pulling me aside for a private conversation. You're talking about deliberately walking into a meeting with a man who's killed multiple people. Let the FBI handle this without putting yourself in danger. Nicole, Cross has been watching me for months. He knows I'm involved in this investigation. If I don't show up tomorrow night, he'll disappear and continue his operation somewhere else. Those women will never be rescued. And if you do show up, you might be killed. David's already dead because of this investigation. I can't lose you too. Her concern was touching, but it also highlighted something I'd been avoiding since finding David's garage. My husband had died carrying the burden of those missing women alone, never sharing the weight of his investigation with the person who loved him most. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. Nicole, David kept this secret because he was trying to protect me, but his protection didn't actually keep me safe.
it just kept me ignorant of the danger I was already in. I'd rather face this threat with full knowledge than remain a target without understanding why. Frank Donovan arrived at 8 o'clock carrying a tactical bag that looked like it contained enough equipment for a small military operation. He was older than I'd expected, probably mid-50s, with gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested years of military service, but his handshake was firm and his eyes held the same determined intensity I'd seen in David during his most focused programming session. "Claire, I want you to know that David talked about you constantly during our planning sessions. He was terrified that this investigation was putting you in danger, but he was also driven by the knowledge that walking away would condemn those women to continued captivity." Mr. Donovan, did David ever express doubts about the rescue operation? Did he think it was too dangerous? Donovan considered the question carefully. David understood the risks, but he also understood the alternatives. Cross's trafficking operation was expanding. The compound David had identified was temporary. Cross moves his prisoners every few months to prevent exactly the kind of rescue we're planning. If we'd waited for official law enforcement to build a case, those women would have been moved to a location we might never find. Agent Marsh called everyone to the main conference room where she'd set up a detailed timeline for the next day's operation. The complexity was overwhelming: multiple FBI teams, local law enforcement coordination, medical personnel, and technical support specialists, all working together to execute simultaneous operations, 60 miles apart. Team Alpha will establish surveillance at Cascade Locks 6 hours before the meeting, Agent Marsh explained. Mrs. Thompson will arrive at the specified location with decoy files, but she'll be wearing surveillance equipment and body armor. The moment Cross attempts to harm her or indicates the meeting is an ambush, tactical teams will intervene. Donovan had spread topographical maps of the mountain compound across a separate table. Team Beta will begin the approach to the compound at sunset tomorrow. Based on David's surveillance, Cross maintains minimal security during his Seattle trips, usually 2 guards and an electronic perimeter system. We'll have a 3-hour window to extract the women and secure evidence before Cross could potentially return. Agent Martinez pointed to the compound maps. "Mr. Donovan, what's our contingency if Cross changes his travel plans or returns early?" David's digital surveillance included tracking software on Cross's vehicles and communication devices. "We'll have real-time intelligence about his location throughout both operations. If he deviates from expected patterns, we abort and extract." The operational planning continued until nearly midnight, with every detail analyzed and contingencies developed for dozens of potential complications. By the time we finished, I felt like I'd been through intensive tactical training, despite never having held a weapon or participated in any kind of law enforcement operation. Agent Marsh walked me to the secure hotel room where I'd be staying until the next evening's meeting. "Miss
Thompson, I want you to understand that you can change your mind about participating in this operation. We could attempt to execute the compound rescue without using you as bait for Cross." Agent Marsh. "Cross specifically demanded that I bring David's files personally. If I don't show up, he'll know it's a law enforcement operation and disappear. Those women might never get another chance at rescue. And you're prepared for the possibility that Cross might try to kill you regardless of whether you cooperate." I thought about David's final weeks, the stress and secrecy that had literally killed him, the courage he'd shown in planning a rescue operation, despite having no military training. "Agent Marsh, my husband died trying to save those women. If completing his mission puts me in danger, that's a risk I'm willing to take." Nicole hugged me goodnight with tears in her eyes, making me promise to follow every safety protocol the FBI had established. Agent Martinez would be staying in the adjoining hotel room, maintaining communication throughout the night and ensuring my security until the operation began. As I tried to sleep in the unfamiliar hotel bed, I thought about the 6 women being held in Cross's mountain compound. Isabella Martinez, who'd been missing for 3 years and whose sister had died trying to find her. Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, Ashley Chen, and 2 others whose names I didn't even know. By tomorrow night, they would either be free, or David's sacrifice would have been meaningless. The meeting at Cascade Locks was scheduled for 11 o'clock. In 18 hours, Vincent Cross would either be in federal custody, or I would be dead. But if Frank Donovan's rescue operation succeeded, David's investigation would finally achieve its purpose. I fell asleep clutching my phone, which contained David's final voice message from the garage. His words about protecting me and fighting for justice had become the foundation for the most dangerous decision of my life. Tomorrow I would discover whether love and courage were enough to defeat the evil that had destroyed so many lives. The alarm was set for 6 in the morning. By sunset tomorrow, everything would be over. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Columbia River Gorge, matching my mood as Agent Martinez and I drove toward the FBI staging area near Cascade Lock. My hands hadn't stopped shaking since I'd put on the body armor hidden beneath my jacket, and the small earpiece that would maintain communication with the tactical team felt foreign and uncomfortable. The staging area was a rest stop 2 miles from the actual meeting location, bustling with FBI agents and technical equipment that looked like it belonged in a military operation, rather than a law enforcement action. Agent Marsh approached our vehicle as we parked, her expression serious but determined. "Mrs. Thompson, we've received confirmation that Cross is en route to the meeting location. Our surveillance indicates he's traveling alone, which suggests he's either very confident or very desperate." She handed me a modified tablet containing the decoy files David had supposedly collected. "Remember, once you hand this over, our technical team will be able to track Cross's digital footprint wherever he goes." Frank Donovan was coordinating with the mountain rescue team from a mobile command center, his voice calm and professional as he issued final instructions to the tactical specialists who would be extracting the missing women. Seeing him in his element made me understand why David had trusted him with such a dangerous operation. "Compound team reports ready for insertion," he announced to Agent Marsh. "Cross's vehicle tracking confirms he's maintaining course toward Cascade Locks. We have a clean window for extraction." Agent Martinez checked her watch. 10:30. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to position you at the overlook in 15 minutes. Are you ready for this?" I thought about Isabella Martinez, held captive for 3 years because no one with authority had believed her sister's investigation. I thought about the teenager Frank Donovan had mentioned, barely older than my college students, whose life had been stolen by Vincent Cross's trafficking network. I thought about David, who died carrying the weight of their suffering alone. "I'm ready," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. The Cascade Locks overlook was a scenic viewpoint popular with tourists during daylight hours, but eerily deserted at 11 o'clock on a cold weeknight. FBI agents had positioned themselves throughout the area, invisible but close enough to intervene if Cross attempted violence. I stood alone at the railing, looking out over the Columbia River while waiting for a man who'd killed my husband and threatened my friend. Cross arrived precisely on time, driving a dark sedan that looked unremarkable except for the tinted windows that prevented me from seeing inside until he opened the door. He was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the kind of average appearance that would make him forgettable in any crowd. The perfect camouflage for a predator who needed to blend into communities while selecting victims. "Claire Thompson," he said, approaching with his hands visible but stopping just outside comfortable conversation distance. "You're more composed than I expected for someone whose life has been turned upside down." "You killed my husband," I said, not bothering with pretense. "You've destroyed the lives of at least 6 women that I know about." Composure isn't something I'm particularly concerned with right now. Cross smiled with what might have been genuine amusement. "Your husband killed himself, Claire." The stress of conducting an illegal investigation into matters that didn't concern him caused a heart attack that could have been avoided if he'd minded his own business. "You were watching our house, monitoring his communications, threatening him indirectly for months. David knew you were closing in on him." "David made choices," Cross said, his tone shifting to something colder. "He chose to investigate me, chose to work with that military friend of his, chose to put his wife in danger by refusing to walk away when he had the chance. Every consequence of those choices belongs to him." The callousness in his voice made me angry enough to forget the FBI's coaching about keeping him talking. "What about Isabella Martinez? What about the other women you've taken? What choices did they make that justified destroying their lives?" Cross studied me with the detached interest of someone examining an insect. "Claire, You're thinking about this emotionally instead of practically. Those women serve a purpose in a business arrangement that spans multiple states and generates substantial revenue. Their individual stories are irrelevant to the larger operation. They're human beings. They're commodities. And speaking of business, do you have David's files? I held up the tablet, fighting the urge to smash it against his head instead of handing it over. Everything David collected during his investigation: digital surveillance, financial records, communication intercepts, photographs of your compound. Cross extended his hand, and I forced myself to place the tablet in his palm. The moment he took possession of it, Agent Marsh's voice crackled through my earpiece. Package delivered. Technical team has remote access established. This contains everything? Cross asked, scrolling through files that looked comprehensive enough to satisfy his concern. Everything David had access to: financial records, surveillance footage, witness statements, digital communications. The only copies that existed. Cross nodded, apparently satisfied with what he was seeing on the tablet screen. Excellent. Claire, you've been surprisingly cooperative for someone who lost her husband because of this investigation. I want this to be over, I said honestly. I want you to disappear and never threaten me or my friends again. That was always the plan, Cross. But there's one small complication we need to address. The change in his tone made my blood run cold. Through my earpiece I could hear Agent Marsh coordinating with tactical teams, but Cross was still standing within the agreed-upon conversation zone. What complication? I asked. Cross reached into his jacket, and I tensed for the appearance of a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a second phone and showed me the screen. Your husband's investigation was more thorough than even you realized, Claire. He didn't just document my current operation, he uncovered evidence of activities going back 5 years. The phone screen showed photographs I'd never seen before, images that appeared to be from David's digital surveillance, but contained information about victims and locations beyond what I'd found in his garage files. David had backup files, Cross continued, hidden copies of evidence that weren't stored with his primary research. I need those files, Claire, or our agreement becomes invalid. Agent Marsh's voice in my earpiece was urgent but controlled. Stall him. Technical team needs more time to complete the trade. I don't know about any backup files, I said. Everything I found in David's garage is what I brought you. Cross smiled again, but this time the expression held no warmth at all. Claire, your husband was a software architect. He understood the importance of redundant systems and backup protocols. He wouldn't have conducted an investigation this comprehensive without creating multiple copies of his evidence. Even if there are backup files, I don't know where David would have hidden them. I think you do know, Cross said, stepping closer. Or you can figure it out. David was methodical about everything. His work, his marriage, his investigation. He would have left you access to those backup files, probably with instructions that would only make sense to someone who knew him intimately. The realization hit me like a physical blow. David's final recording in the garage had mentioned protecting me, ensuring I had everything I needed to stay safe. He hadn't just left me evidence of Cross's crimes, he'd left me leverage. You're afraid, I said suddenly. The files I just gave you don't contain everything, and you know it. David created an insurance policy that you can't access without my help. Cross's facade of casual conversation cracked slightly. Claire, you're going to help me locate those backup files, or the people you care about are going to start disappearing. Nicole Porter, Sarah Fleming, Lily Chen, they'll vanish one by one until you decide to cooperate fully. Through my earpiece, Frank Donovan's voice cut through the tactical chatter. Compound secure. 6 women extracted safely. Isabella Martinez is alive and conscious. Medical team en route. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I nearly collapsed. The women were safe. David's mission had succeeded, even if he hadn't lived to see it completed. Mrs. Thompson, maintain position. Agent Marsh's voice commanded. We need 30 more seconds for complete technical penetration of Cross's systems. Cross had noticed my change in expression. Claire, you look like you've received good news. I hope that doesn't mean you're not taking my threats seriously. I'm taking them very seriously. But I think you should know that while we've been talking,
Federal agents have been raiding your mountain compound. The women you've been holding prisoner are free. Cross went very still, his hand moving toward his jacket again. This time, Agent Marsh's tactical team didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. FBI, get down on the ground. Agents emerged from concealment positions throughout the overlook, their weapons trained on Cross as spotlights illuminated the entire area. Cross raised his hands slowly, the tablet containing David's decoy files falling to the asphalt. Vincent Cross, you're under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder, Agent Marsh announced as tactical officers secured him with restraint. As Cross was led away, he looked back at me with an expression of genuine surprise. You knew this was a trap from the beginning. I knew my husband was smarter than you gave him credit for, I replied. David didn't just investigate your operation, he planned its destruction. Agent Martinez appeared at my side, removing the surveillance equipment that had recorded Cross's admissions and tracked his digital communications. Mrs. Thompson, it's over. Cross's entire network is being rolled up simultaneously across 3 states. Frank Donovan approached from the mobile command center, his face showing the exhaustion and relief of someone who'd just completed a successful military operation. Claire, I wanted you to know that Isabella Martinez asked about David specifically. When we told her that her rescue was made possible by a software architect who'd spent months investigating her disappearance, she cried. The emotional weight of the past week finally caught up with me. David was still gone, killed by the stress of an investigation he'd never intended to survive. But his work had saved 6 lives and dismantled a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for years. 3 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Portland, watching Vincent Cross receive 6 consecutive life sentences for crimes that would ensure he never threatened another woman. Isabella Martinez had testified about her 3 years in captivity, her voice strong and clear, as she described the hell David had helped end. After the sentencing, Isabella approached me in the courthouse hallway. She was thinner than in the photographs David had collected, marked by trauma that would take years to heal, but her eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had made her sister refuse to give up the search. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to thank you for finishing what David started. Lucia would have been so grateful to know that her investigation ultimately saved us. David would have wanted me to tell you that he never stopped believing you could be found, I said. Your rescue was the most important thing in his life during those final months. Isabella nodded, tears in her eyes. Agent Martinez told me that David kept a photograph of me on his wall, with the word missing written underneath. She said he looked at that photograph every day while planning our rescue. He did. David carried the weight of your captivity every single day, and it cost him his life. But he never wavered in his commitment to bringing you home. I'd moved to Ashland 6 weeks after Cross's arrest, settling into a small cottage near the mountains where David and I had planned to retire someday. The life insurance money and the sale of our Victorian house had provided financial security, but more importantly, the distance from Millbrook had given me space to grieve and heal. Nicole visited every few weeks, bringing news from Portland and updates on the ongoing federal prosecutions of Cross's associates. Sarah Fleming had returned to teaching yoga with a renewed appreciation for personal safety. Lily Chen had transferred to a different coffee shop in a safer neighborhood. All of us had been changed by our encounter with evil, but we'd survived it together. Frank Donovan had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood the unique grief of losing David while celebrating the success of his mission. He'd returned to his quiet retirement in Estacada, but we spoke regularly about David's courage and the women whose lives he'd saved. The cottage in Ashland had a small garage that I'd converted into a writing studio. The novel I'd abandoned during my marriage to David had been replaced by a different kind of story, a memoir about love, secrets, and the price of heroism. Isabella Martinez had agreed to contribute her perspective, and Frank Donovan had provided technical details about the rescue operation that completed David's work. On quiet evenings I sat in my writing studio and thought about the man I'd married, the software architect who'd transformed himself into someone capable of taking on a trafficking network. David had kept secrets that nearly destroyed our marriage, but those same secrets had saved 6 lives and brought justice to women who'd been written off by the system. I'd learned to live with the contradiction of loving someone whose hidden life had been both a betrayal and an act of supreme courage. David Thompson had been an imperfect husband, but a perfect hero, and his legacy would live on in the women who were free because he'd refused to look away from their suffering. The garage unit in Millbrook remained empty, its monthly rent, a small memorial to the investigation that had changed everything. Sometimes I drove past it on visits to Portland, remembering the afternoon when I'd opened that metal door and discovered that my entire life had been built on foundations I'd never seen. David's secret had destroyed the marriage I thought I knew, but it had also revealed the depth of love and courage that defined the man I'd chosen to spend my life with. In the end, that knowledge was enough to build a new life on, one informed by truth rather than comfortable illusion. The missing women were home, Vincent Cross would die in prison, and David Thompson's investigation had become a federal case study in civilian law enforcement. Cooperation. My husband had died keeping secrets, but those secrets had set captives free and brought a predator to justice. It wasn't the ending either of us had planned, but it was the ending David would have chosen if he'd known the cost of his courage. And in my cottage in Ashland, surrounded by mountains and memories, I was finally at peace with the man I'd loved and the price he'd paid for doing what was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.